through. That'd be helpful. Great. Thank you. That's good. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to get underway. My name is Sue Cross. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Nonprofit News. INN is a network and also a staff supporting that network of about 200 nonprofit news organizations across the country. They're all nonpartisan, independent, and operate with certain standards of editorial independence and financial transparency. This call came about because, as many of you know, there have been cuts of a couple thousand jobs in journalism just over the last month since the first of the year. And here at INN and others in nonprofit news tend to get a lot of calls after this happens, and it raises the awareness and people start wondering, can a nonprofit newsroom save local coverage? Can it help us get coverage of this key issue that newspapers are no longer covering here? Can it help me save my journalism career and keep doing this work I do to serve my community? So today we're going to explore some of those questions and what role nonprofit news is serving in this arena. Our remarks today are really addressed to those of you coming in from outside the nonprofit news community itself. So maybe you're a community leader wondering, what will it take to restore news in my area? Or you're a journalist answering these questions. We know we have many members today on the call as well, many INN members and leaders of nonprofit news organizations. So a lot of what we talk about is probably going to be old hat to you, but we hope it's also helpful to you in answering these questions in your communities as well. A couple of introductions. Joining me in the presentation today will be Fran Scarlett. Fran's our Chief Knowledge Officer at INN, and she runs all of our business coaching programs. She's a professional business coach with a Harvard MBA, but she also comes from a journalism background. And we do a lot of helping journalists figure out how to become nonprofit business leaders. Jules Shapiro is our Director of Communications and Marketing, and Mara Jazor is also on. Mara's our membership coordinator. And Jules and Mara will be managing the chat. There were about 100 people, actually more than that, signed up for this call, and so it's a big group. So we're going to have you all muted just to make this workable for everybody, but we are going to save as much time as we can for Q&A, and then open this up for Q&A. And do a quick spin through. When we get to that point, and even during the conversation, there is this chat button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post questions there at any point. And those of you who are from INN member organizations, feel free to join us in answering any of those questions. Go ahead and chat if you have an insight or information you think could help. So as we go through today, a quick kind of overview. We're going to go through the growth of news nonprofits, what's happening, where is this going, what models we see working out there, what the options are to pay for this kind of reporting. For journalists, what do you want to think about if you're thinking about going into nonprofit news? And considerations for community leaders as well. How do you get something going? Key steps to get started, and finally some things that are different in this kind of emerging nonprofit news space. So let's start with a quick overview about what's happening and kind of the state of nonprofit news. We are really seeing something remarkable happening, even as the journalism declines are accelerating and are really serious. We are seeing communities collectively take the future of their local news, and sometimes on a community around a topic, into their own hands, and they are building new kinds of news organizations. So INN was formed 10 years ago. At the time, there were just about 24 nonprofit newsrooms, and that's pretty much the whole field at the time. Today, we know there are more than 250 nonprofit newsrooms. That growth is accelerating. It had been around 15% year over year. Now it's looking more like 20% growth year after year. About half of those are local and state. About a third of them are focusing on a single topic. They're really doing deep expert coverage, beat coverage of complex civic affairs, health, social justice, criminal justice, that type of thing. And they're concentrated in the type of journalism that takes an investment of time and money. That kind of makes sense. It's the things that are hard for for-profit companies to cover and still make a margin. So investigative news, deep explanatory and topical reporting, community and state coverage that requires shoe leather reporting, and data reporting that's mining and analyzing statistics that are out there to bring insights to the public. Nonprofit newsrooms generally are small. The median staff is about 8, but that varies greatly. There are many, particularly in the startup stage, that might be only 2 people, on up through Texas Tribune, ProPublica, and quite a few national ones where the staff size may be 70 or more. Taken all together in total, we know there are more than 3,000 people working in nonprofit news, and out of that 3,000, they're fielding a journalism force of about 2,200 reporters, editors, in the newsroom jobs. If you think about it another way in the context of what's being lost on the commercial side, nonprofit newsrooms so far are replacing about 10% of the jobs that have been lost overall in newspapers, and that is slowly gaining. So let's take a look for a minute at where this is all going and where we think it can go. Our aim and our projection as we look across the next 10 years is that we can see another tenfold increase in nonprofit news. And that's really significant. If it's increased tenfold over the last 10 years, if we can push that level of growth on a continued basis, and it is accelerating, we think it is quite possible and quite achievable that nonprofit newsrooms will be fielding a reporting force of about 20,000 journalists by the year 2030. So roughly 10 years, excuse me, through 2029. And that growth is coming from 4 directions. You're seeing nonprofits started in a lot more communities as communities try to restore local news or create local news they never had. We're seeing expansion of franchise models. So ProPublica is a big national organization. You're now seeing local startups around it. Chalkbeat similarly is a national education publication that now has Chalkbeats in many cities and states. For-profits are converting to nonprofit. This is still a relatively small number, but we're getting increasing calls about it. Sometimes this could be a for-profit newspaper looking to create a nonprofit research or reporting fund alongside it, or just convert entirely. And finally, we are seeing what I think is the beginning of something that will grow much larger. We're seeing big bets. We're seeing big investments being made in cities around the country. The Revson Foundation has put significant resources in and gathered others to create the city in New York City and build up local coverage. The Memphian in Memphis, it was funded by more than $6 million raised locally to launch this local news publication. And the American Journalism Project is currently raising $50 million to try to invest in 20 to 25 outlets, give them some significant capital, improve some large-scale models. So this is achievable, and the key to getting there, we believe, is as communities change their thinking about news, to think of news as a community asset and support it as a community asset, like the library, the schools, the roads. So if you think about in most towns, you have a booster club that supports local athletics. You might have the Friends of the Library supporting the library. News is undergoing the same shift from growing not as a business, but as a public good and a civic center. The other thing I want to mention is some very good news that just came out this week. There is a year-end campaign that happens every year called Newsmatch. It's supported by some of the largest foundations that support journalism nationwide, and they match individuals giving. So individual donors gave last year more than $116 million to nonprofit news organizations. Those are individuals giving $1,000 or less. That's a 50% increase over what we saw in 2017. And for the average newsroom that participated year over year, they saw an 11% gain in giving in the last 2 months of the year. So they raised together 7.6 million in 60 days. That tells us a lot that public support of news is growing and people are backing the news that serves their communities. So let's switch here. That's kind of the overview of the overall field. And I'm going to hand off to Fran to talk about, let's think through what this might mean for your community if you're trying to start something there, or if you're a journalist, what this might mean for the opportunities you have in nonprofit news. So Fran?
Sure, hi. Hope everyone can hear me. As Sue said, I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer and sort of the business side person at INN. So one of the things I remember the most, since Sue mentioned Harvard, I'll say a quote from one of my professors that said, "When you're in doubt about how well you're doing, count your cash." And I've remembered that ever since then in personal and business. And so to that end, one of the things that we try to emphasize here at INN is that nonprofit is not a silver bullet. It's not a magic wand that makes everything okay. You still need to build a business and find sources of revenue. And there are many, we talk about 8, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes, but the sources are just different than they are in a for-profit entity. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. There isn't something that you can say, tell me what the template is and I'll just go out and do that. This is an evolving space. The nonprofit news ecosystem is evolving and there's lots of experimentation. It's a mix of revenue sources. That's the key to remember. There isn't one place that you can go that's going to be, once you go there, you're set. That's not the way it works. So let's talk about the eight revenue sources that nonprofit news organizations look at to make up their mix. One, Sue mentioned individual donors, and that is very much a stable place for people to focus on, especially in the early stages of their newsprofit life cycle. Another is major gifts. Major donors is another term that people use, who are also individuals, but have the ability to give well over 1,000 or more, tens of thousands, depending on the level of wealth, to particular organizations. Many people, when they come into nonprofit news, talk about foundation money and grant money. And that used to be at a national level, and we're encouraging people, and people are finding success by looking at local foundations, community foundations as a source for that grant funding. We consider that to be seed funding. It's money that gets you up and going, but almost every foundation is going to ask you, how do you intend to sustain yourself? So this is startup money, how do you intend to sustain yourself? And the answer is not, you guys will keep giving us money. So that's, I think, a really important point to drive home. In addition to individual donors, there's another reader revenue we consider membership. Membership is an ongoing individual donation, if you want to think about individual donations being a one-off, and membership is, you know, monthly, yearly, whatever the time sequence is for that. Sponsorship and underwriting is another area of revenue growth. A lot of our members do sponsorships and underwriting, finding sources that are interested in their coverage, who want to really sort of do what we would call some more branding, image advertising versus transactional advertising. Events are, I love events because I think events are a threefer in my mind. They're a revenue source, they're a way to engage your community, and they're usually places where, like I said, you can engage your audience and build your audience. Another source of revenue is training and other services. A lot of nonprofit news organizations that are tied to universities, especially because it's part of a university's mission, tend to offer training programs for aspiring journalists, aspiring writers, and charge revenue for those trainings. So That's, again, another revenue source. Syndication, sharing your work and charging a fee for that work to other outlets is another form of revenue that many members look at engaging with. And then the old school advertising is still something that is applicable even in the nonprofit world. The key is a revenue mix. This is a perfect time to say, do not put all your eggs in one basket. The organizations that are more successful are the ones that have no one source of revenue is controlling their destiny. And so I think that's really an important point to make. Okay, so let's talk about how to get started. And in this conversation, as Sue mentioned earlier, we're gonna really focus on local and state. Although there are quite a few of our members who are topic focused, we can answer questions after this, but the focus of my talk right now will be around local and state startups. So let's go right into it. Ask your community what it needs. Ask your community what they think the gaps are, because ultimately the community is going to be your audience. And if you're creating something that they're not thinking they need, then you have some misalignment. So don't assume because you are a crime reporter and you're now wanting to start your own nonprofit news organization that you're going to be able to focus on crime. That might not be the need in your community as your community sees it. And it's really important to understand it has to be about them and not necessarily about you. The good news about asking the community what it needs is that you're doing primary research, and journalists are great at research. So it's really important to check in with the people who are going to be your potential audience as to what it is that they're looking for. What do they see as the gaps in coverage in your community? And who are the audiences you're going to go after? Who are you reporting for? It's really important to understand the audience, the size of the audience, who they are. Are they influencers? Whatever role they play in your community, it's really important for you to get some insight into who those people are. Broad is not necessarily good. I always say, when in doubt, you need to hone it in and focus. Everybody is not your audience. If everybody's your audience, then nobody's your audience. The more you can target who you are really trying to reach, the better chance you are of creating coverage and content that's going to appeal to them, that's going to make them stick around and continue to read your coverage. Some examples that we have from the membership, Voice of Orange County focuses in lots of areas, but one of the key areas they focus in is housing and homelessness, which is a huge problem in Orange County. Another member, City Bureau in Chicago, focused on one small, not small because it's Chicago, but the southwest portion of the city of Chicago as their initial coverage area. They've expanded beyond that, but in the beginning, they focused in on what it is that they could do and bring to that particular community. So again, who is your audience? What are they about? What do they need? And then lastly, how do you position your content to fit the needs of those audiences that you've identified? And how will you reach them in your first 2 years? How do you plan to get your content to them? And so that's figuring out what your value proposition is. So between those three components, you now have a product plan. One of the things I do in my coaching is I help people sort of set up what we call a business model canvas to help you flesh out all the key components of that product plan. It's one thing to know how you're going to reach the audience, but what do you need to have on the back end to make sure you deliver what you say you're going to deliver on a consistent basis so that people will come back time and time and time again. Capital. So we talked about, I said, when in doubt, count your cash, right? So raise seed capital. INN recommends that you raise 2 years worth of capital upfront. We find that there are people who start with less than that, and what happens is you're always chasing your tail, trying to raise money, and it actually diverts from your ability to focus on the journalism. So we say, spend some time figuring out how much money you're going to need for 2 years and raise that seed capital. Use the time to also build what we call your generosity network. As you talk to people in your community, see who has energy around your concepts, see who gets excited. Ask them to be on an advisory board, ask them to tell people about your idea and to build enthusiasm for your idea among their friends and colleagues. Talk to local and family foundations. You might not be ready to ask them for money yet, but it's the foundation game, and it's not a game, but it kind of is a game, is there's a courting process. There's a courting process. You don't just sort of jump right in and say, hey, give me money. One of the things that we've seen folks in our network do is many local foundations aren't familiar with journalism per se, but if you can make the argument that by supporting journalism, they're supporting the civic health of the community, that tends to get the attention of family foundations and local foundations. So no, they may not support journalism per se, but they're very much committed to the communities they serve. And so using that argument has proven to be successful for several of our members. Build your product. It's not just the journalism. Oh, I know you wish it was just the journalism, but it isn't just the journalism. There's a business here. How can you start? How can you bootstrap? A demo site and email newsletters are ways to start without a lot of capital, but that can showcase your content. If I was going to invest in a business, regardless if it's nonprofit or for-profit, if you can show me what you've done already, I'm more inclined to sort of say, okay, this person is serious. I can actually see what they're doing, versus if you promise me that you're going to do something. So even starting with an email newsletter is a plus, is a step up from just sort of, having an idea in your head. Where can you get the biggest bang for your buck? Where can you get the biggest impact for your coverage? That would be a focus. And the key is, what can you deliver that is different from what anybody else is delivering, right? What can you deliver that your community cannot get anywhere else? If you don't talk to your community, you're not gonna know that answer. Build in analytics and goals from the start. Where do you wanna get to? What are you trying to achieve? If you don't know where you're going, you never know when you get there. Also, set standards. Editorial, one of the things that I think sets INN apart is our editorial independence. We're passionate that our members have editorial independence and that they have donor transparency. And it's really, really important in this climate of people not trusting media. So the ability to tell your audience that, here are all the people who give us money, and it doesn't mean that we won't cover them. Or here's what here's what our editorial policy is, and here's what our editorial independence is up front, is really, really important in gaining trust with your audience. Take the time to sort of think that through, suss that out well in advance. Do not worry about forming a 501c3 right away. One of the most beautiful things in the nonprofit world is something called fiscal sponsorship. It's the ability to piggyback off an existing nonprofit, and for a fee, they handle all the paperwork, all the budgets, and all those sorts of things, and allow you to have nonprofit status without all the administrative overhead and hassles that go along with that. Again, it's for a fee. And INN is a fiscal sponsor for many of our member organizations. So with that, let me just move on quickly to some things that say, if this sounds daunting, here are some things that I just want to remind you that as journalists, you have in your wheelhouse already. Finding out what people need, research, you guys are great at research. Asking for money. Now, I know you don't want to ask for money. I know you don't like to ask for money. The separation of church and state runs deep. But in this new world order, yes, you're going to have to ask for money. But journalists, you guys are great storytellers, and writing grants and talking about what your passion is and your mission is great storytelling. You guys already do that well. you're going to have to ask people to support your journalism, and you're going to have to tell them a story that inspires them in order for them to support you. And you guys know how to tell stories. Some areas where you're probably going to need some support is the business stuff. We recommend that startups, the leader, the executive director, spend 50% of the time on journalism and 50% on the time on fundraising. That's a lot, you know, especially when you want to do the journalism 100% of the time. If that's who you are, that you want to do the journalism 100% of the time, that's okay. Find a partner that can do the business side. You have to be able to do the business side to execute the mission that you have. And so if you don't think that that's a thing you can do, the business side, then find someone else who's willing to do that and partner with that person. It doesn't have to be, it can be a part-time person, it can be a retired person, but it's vital to understand the business side, because that is how you're going to be able to sustain yourself to deliver the mission that you are setting out to do. It takes time to build a news organization. It takes time to build a business. We keep saying 2 years, because it takes about 2 years to kind of get up to speed and have the funding and build the audience, or start building audience. You never stop building audience, really. But it takes about 2 years to start making an impact in your community. It's to start finding the number of people who are willing to support you on an ongoing basis. You can bootstrap, you can certainly, but it's a lot harder and the success rates are lower. And so there's a lot of perseverance required in this nonprofit news space. But another trait, journalists are incredibly able to persevere. So I think those are all good things. Those are all good traits to have going into this game. So now I'll turn it back to Sue.
Great. We're going to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. I think you'll be seeing on your screen a picture of aspen trees. And we think of those as an analogy. A lot of people ask us why, you know, are these models working now? Are nonprofit news organizations surviving, and how are they surviving? And these aspens are a good analogy for that. People will often talk about startups in news as grassroots organizations, but if you think about it, grassroots organizations are really, really fragile. You know, one downturn, one stomp, and that shoot of grass is gone. Heather Chaplin of the New School in New York, who does design work in journalism, gave us this analogy that traditional newspapers and journalism now is like the big tree in the center of town, but when it gets sick and dies, you're kind of treeless. And the grassroots are too fragile. And what happens with aspens is they all look like individual trees, just like these individual news organizations are highly tailored to their communities, and that's a strength. But underneath the ground, they're all connected by common roots. They're a kind of plant known as a rhizome. And the thing is with aspens, when the rest of the forest burns, they sprout right back, and they also tend to be much more resilient. Bamboo is another one. And we think this actually is not just like a nicety as the network of these off on the side. We really think it's a core part of the business model, because we see news organizations across the country sharing resources, sharing what works, and really forming an ecosystem. And they're formally doing it in some states and some regions where they actually are kind of schooling up and formally connecting to each other. But even informally, they're tapping into this network. And I'm mentioning it here because if you go into this field, it's really, really important that you tap into these networks early. INN is a network, of course, and that's what we live to do. But there are others as well. If you're starting something very local or hyper-local, the local independent online news network is another good example. And then in philanthropy, if you're a journalist going into nonprofit news, you're also taking on a second profession and joining a second professional group, and that is in philanthropy and in the world of nonprofits. There was a national organization called the Council on Nonprofits. That's a great place to start. They have state and in many cases city organizations as well, and that's a network you should tap into. So this network aspect is one of the key things that sets nonprofit news apart. There are others. The quality of the journalism, is very high. Nonprofits win awards. Not that that's the only measure, but it really shows the depth and how much original reporting they're doing. They have a level of trust and engagement in their communities. They are deeply rooted in their communities, and they do a lot of events, and it's a two-way street. They share content. Most of them make their content available to other media, and they have this mission focus that does come through in how they distribute information. And then there is a culture to nonprofits too that that I'll close on here because it's really significant. For those of you who are journalists, it's a safe bet. You've been working hard for a long time. I'd say journalism hasn't been an easy job for a long time, if ever. If you go into nonprofit news, in many ways, it's harder. You're inventing something new. There's no set path, but it's also really exhilarating. And INN members bring just such a deep passion to this work. They're really inspiring in terms of they're going after big stories, significant stories, taking risks to invent something new. There's a kind of audacity and creativity they bring to reinventing journalism and how they help each other in the network. So as we go to Q&A, keep in mind there's a few dozen of these folks who have done this and are running nonprofit news organizations on this call. And so I invite them to join us in answering any of your questions. We're going to shift over now to the conversation in Q&A. And we also will be putting up some resources on the chat screen. I also saw a question earlier. Somebody said, would this be emailed? This session is being recorded and you will be able to access it after. And also see the list of those resources. You also can find most of those resources on inn.org. So let's switch to chat and make this more interactive. And so your chat button again is at the bottom of your screen, and post your questions there. And Mara and Jules will be repeating those questions. You can direct them to any of us or just in general.
Great. So we have a question here from Tom Crane. The question is, in community radio, monetization seems to be a pressure. If something isn't bringing in money, how can we justify its presence? Doesn't the search for funding automatically corrupt?
It's a fair question. I can't speak so much to community radio on that. But the core question in journalism is, how do you pay for this reporting? I think it's less direct in the nonprofit world than in advertising, where you really do have to keep this level of audience or you lose that ad revenue, which is usually tied to size. In nonprofits, funders, whether they're individual donors or family foundations or journalism foundations or topics, tend to want to see the influence and the impact you have, but that isn't always in sheer numbers. That may be deep coverage of an issue that isn't all that popular, and you're not going to get thousands and thousands of people following your breaking news every day, but that there could be a core group that follows that issue and needs that coverage, and your worth is gauged that way. I think foundation funding definitely, where it influences is not so much like corrupting or having input on individual stories. There's pretty broad understanding of editorial independence, and funders don't expect to review stories or shape stories. I think it is fair to say if there is money for coverage of a topic, it is more likely that topic is going to get covered because there may not be any economic basis, any commercial economic basis for that coverage anymore. So in that way, the availability of funding, I would say, does shape coverage and enables some coverage there.
We have a couple questions on fiscal sponsorship. First from Frank Etheridge, is there a limit or best practice for how long an organization can operate under a fiscal sponsor?
There's a couple rules of thumb, and they are just that. There are organizations that exist under fiscal sponsorship pretty much in perpetuity. Others will do it on a very temporary basis while they get up and running. There's a rule of thumb in an organization called the National Fiscal Sponsors Association, which we belong to as well, that fiscal sponsorship tends to be really advantageous and financially advantageous till you're up to about $500,000 a year in annual revenue. And once you're above $500,000 a year in annual revenue, that's when you may want to look and say, is it going to be more cost effective? Are we big enough now that we want to take on handling all this stuff by ourselves? So that's the kind of general rule of thumb out there. The variance in what organizations actually do varies widely. The typical dynamic is that your board will push to get your own 501c3, and it tends to be just a matter of pride or people feeling like, do we really exist if we don't have our own 501c3? But operationally, that rarely is the best thing to do early in your organization. Once you file for a 501c3, there's you have a lot of other filings and there's paperwork, and you're operating something in the public trust. And so the IRS and states and so forth really do watch, and you have filings and have to show that you are operating your business in the public trust and using all your funds to fulfill your mission. And so there's an administrative load around that. I mean, you can understand it. You're getting a tax break. You are operating in the public interest, but it does trigger these things. So that's why people end up doing fiscal sponsorship, because that's handled more centrally.
Thanks, Sue. One more question about fiscal sponsorship from Christopher Swope. Can you say more about the pros and cons of fiscal sponsorship versus a 501c3? Do these models require forming a board of directors?
Two things. You want to form a board of directors in any case. It's much more core to your business than it would be for a for-profit. Those are the trustees. Your board ultimately is legally responsible. So when you are a fiscally sponsored organization, it depends a bit on your sponsor. Your formal board of directors is that of the sponsor. But for when we sponsor organizations, we require you to have an advisory board. So it's kind of a proto board when you're a sponsored organization, so that you do have broader community ties. You're building a base of support. And you have your evangelists and also guidance that you're accountable to your board. So while you're fiscally sponsored, it would be an advisory board, and then it becomes a board once you're a full 501c3. Keep in mind, when you're fiscally sponsored, you still are a 501c3. You're just under someone else's umbrella. So it's not fiscal sponsorship versus 501c3. It's more how you gain that 501c3 status. The big advantages are lowering your admin costs and distracting work when you're really trying to form your business model and get up and running. That's a huge advantage, and you don't have to have a bookkeeper and set up all these systems. You generally will be covered by your sponsor's charity registration. Which you have good financial practices to begin with. The downside is there is a little bit of inconvenience. You spend money, your fiscal sponsor, you have to submit that and then get a draw of funds. They hold your funds and that's passed through. I don't want to go into more specifics than that because there are various kinds of fiscal sponsorships. So some actually all your employees are part of it and they run your programs and it's a very deep and broad relationship. And there are others like the kind we do that's really only a financial relationship and you still run your programs and so forth. So it varies quite a bit. If you go on inn.org, in addition to information about our fiscal sponsorship, you will find links to the organizations that have information about other fiscal sponsors as well. And sometimes we'll advise people to be fiscally sponsored locally, not through INN, because depending where you are, a local fiscal sponsor organization may have connections to funders or the community there that gives you a broad base of connections. Whereas coming to INN, you don't have that local connection, but you do have independence, because we only sponsor journalists, and we aren't, you know, you're free of any of that kind of local ties that can sometimes get in the way of an editorial independence, or at least create a perception of a conflict.
Thanks, Sue. Corinne Prado is asking, would a field canvas be effective in getting the word out and getting donations from locals about a new local newspaper?
Yeah, Fran, you wanna?
I was going to take that.
Okay.
Connie, if what you mean by a field canvas is just going out and telling people you're going to do this, yeah, but it might be better, again, back to, instead of telling them what you're going to do, it might be better to start with going out and asking them what they feel is missing in the community. So instead of it being journalist driven, you're likely to hit on the right content if it's community driven, right? So going out and talking to the community and sort of hearing where they're, and sharing your thoughts and getting feedback. Maybe you're on the right track and they're going to offer you some input that might make you go, oh, I didn't quite think about that. Maybe if I shift just a little bit and I pivot, I'll be right dead in the center of what my community is needing. So again, this is about asking your community, because you need an audience. And so if you don't talk to the audience, you're not going to have any idea of what it is that's going to make the audience want to engage with you on an ongoing basis. So I think you have to have a clear idea of what you're interested in doing, you know, so that if somebody says, well, what are you doing? You can frame it. But I think you need to leave it open and flexible enough that you can get input to form what it is going to be, what is going to be your value proposition, what is going to be your content.
Thanks, Fran. Another question here from Sean Collins. How does a newsroom of one define their scope and hold himself accountable with both editor and reporter hats on? In a community radio station, how does the executive director, a fundraiser, supervise without crossing an ethical line?
So a couple of thoughts about that. I would say if you're a staff of one, you are in the position more of a freelancer, and I think you need to find an editor. And I'm saying that as a journalist of many years. Everyone needs an editor, right? So generally, the nonprofits we're dealing with do have more than one person. Sometimes that's a volunteer or part-time. But if you're really solo, your chances are you are more like a freelancer, and you do need to find an editor. I think, and that's just a matter of quality journalism. Never mind whether it's nonprofit or for-profit. The line between fundraising and editorial is different in a nonprofit. It's not the firewall. It's not the I don't hear anything. I have nothing to do with fundraising, and so it doesn't exist. I can't be compromised. Your ethics have to live inside you, and you have to be able to articulate them and state them. And so you may be raising funds and asking people to support your journalism. If you're in that position, you have to be putting out there and stating there that, look, we're asking you to support us because we represent editorial independence. And so you may need to send up other structures. So if a donor wants to give you story ideas or a donor wants input, they have some route to do it, that it's not directly to you, the journalist. Because donors should not have input on your coverage because they're donors. But it's human nature. If somebody's interested in you and involved in you, it doesn't necessarily mean they want to corrupt you. It's human nature. They've heard of a story. They want you to cover it. They might be excited that you're there to cover it. So you want to think through and create a mechanism that might be a neutral line where it's a tip line where people can give you stories, tips anonymously or something, and send donors there. So you're not getting in that direct back and forth. Most people do change hats. Executive directors can be editors, but they also are winning support. But there usually is also a development person directly handling the funding. So it can be done very ethically and very clearly, but you have to think it through and build in those things so that you are getting ahead of any conflicts of interest.
Thanks. Courtney Bankston asks, this might be one for Fran, in reference to talking to the community and asking what they want, what are your suggestions for going about that? Surveys, focus groups?
I answered that in the chat, but I'll say it again in case it's people missed that. I think the ability to engage directly with your potential audience is very important. And so I say it's shoe leather. I mean, this is what you guys know how to do well. Go out and talk to people. Invite a bunch of people for coffee in the library conference room and just sort of talk to them and hear what's going on and what their thoughts are. You know, you could do that before you have your idea crafted. You could do it after you have your idea crafted, but not fully, complete, wherever you feel like it's important. I think earlier is better. But engagement with the audience, being able to see there's excitement in their eyes around your idea, being able to say, ooh, these people are really passionate about this, and then being able to tap into those people as potential advisors, potential board members. You can't do, and I don't feel like that happens through a survey, right? I think this is sort of grassroots primary research time.
There are a couple ways, kind of tactics to leverage other groups. So first of all, if you're covering news, there's probably groups in your community that are very civically engaged, right? The PTA, a city council. I mean, in one of the big meetings in New York City about restoring local coverage that led to that Repson investment I mentioned, it was a gathering like I've never seen. It was about 80% journalists, but then there were local politicians, and there was a state lawmaker and I think a congressman there, and they laughed. They said, this is just bizarre to be here, but we have we're very concerned that there isn't local coverage. And they talked from a government standpoint about how worrisome it was. And so I think you want to talk to people in the community who are worried about the lack of coverage. And if you tap into those groups, if you ask to come speak to those groups, you're getting the input from people who might be your starting core audience because they really care about the community issues. And then beyond that, you can go out, you can ask them who else you should talk to, ask them to pull groups of neighbors together and hold little dinners for you. So you're not doing it one at a time. You're asking people who are interested to pull other groups of people who are interested and build your support that way.
Great. Zachary Smith asks, what are some particular obstacles, pressures INN has observed in startups built around smaller cities, like those with populations under 100,000? Are there particular beats that do not tend to build an audience?
Well, it tends, the smaller your location and the narrower your topic, the tougher that is. And it's just a question of scale. So it is hard. I mean, that's the reason local news is having such a difficult time, because you don't have the scale that you can have with national or even statewide. So there are extra challenges in a smaller community. You might have to be a little broader. It may affect what funding models work there. So in a smaller community, you might have a family foundation or a corporate foundation that's very concerned about the health of the community and might take a bigger funding piece. You might want to do membership or individual reader donations, but because your population is small, that may be less of a model for you or a smaller piece of the mix than it would be in a bigger community. So you do have to think about the size in that. I think where it gets particularly challenging is if you want to cover just one type of news or just one topic in a very small city. So we do have many publications, for example, that cover health issues across the state. You could probably find enough people that would track public health issues maybe in a major city. You get down to a city of 100,000, creating a publication as narrow as tracking public health in a city under 100,000, it may not be viable because it's just too thin a slice in too small a place. A couple things you can do if that is the case is see, can you broaden that so you cover the topic you want to cover statewide? Are there other media that would subsidize your coverage? So you're not producing it just for one newspaper or one broadcast station, but creating an arrangement with the State Press Association so they all could use it, for example. Those are some ideas depending if you want a topic specific in a small place.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions right now, but if you have any, type them up and we will answer them. Do you have any, just I guess, thoughts that you'd like to add after answering these questions?
This one I'll mention is Fran said earlier, we kind of skipped over topical news, but that is a big growth area. About a third of the nonprofits across the country are covering a specific topic. So if you're doing that, those do tend to be more heavily grant and foundation funded because they're drawing not just from journalism foundations, but from foundations and grant givers who are interested in that particular topic. So whether it's energy or agriculture or environment and so forth. So if you're looking in those areas, that can work. Again, like the answer to the last question, you're probably going to want to look at a state or regional or national basis. And you may be a little more likely to start with grant funding than something that is local or state. Okay, well, I think we're just about at the top of the hour, so.
We have one more question. Are there examples of for-profits going non-profit? I'd like to take this one. Are there examples of for-profits going non-profit or starting the funds you described? I know there are for-profits going non-profits. I remember working with a fairly good size for-profit had significant budget. The funders that were funding them were giving them $750,000 a year, but their expenses were more than $1 million. And so the funders said, we're not giving you any more. You better figure out a way to fill up that gap. And so that was one of the ways that they said, you know what, if we could get the 750 and then we could go fundraise and get individual donations, to at least stay where we are, but ideally grow even more. That's what we're going to do. That was part of their thinking, and they made the shift in a relatively short time. Within 6 months, they made the shift from when I had the conversation to when they declared that it was done. So, and that one stands out the most to me, but just because of how efficient they were with it. But we've had several other for-profits move to nonprofits. Sue can speak more to that as well.
A couple you can look at, and these two have at least written about the process and why they made the switch and how it worked. The Rivard Report, now called the San Antonio Report, in San Antonio, Texas. The Honolulu Civil Beat, which was founded by Pierre Omidyar as a for-profit, switched to a nonprofit and is doing very well. There are a couple other more exotic forms of this. So the Philadelphia Inquirer is a for-profit, but it's now owned by a community-based nonprofit, the Lenfest Institute, and a nonprofit framework around that. The same thing happened in Fairbanks and Kodiak, Alaska, where you had for-profit newspapers that kind of were ceded to community-based nonprofits. So those are kind of complex structures. I only know of a couple that have created parallel, I don't want to say parallel, but they have created nonprofit funds. The Half Moon Bay newspaper was going to go nonprofit. They ultimately stayed for profit. Sometimes publications do that because they want to make political endorsements. And if you are a nonprofit, you cannot make partisan political endorsements. So they stayed for profit, and then some in the community formed a nonprofit fund to help support the more significant reporting. Bay City News, which is a local news service up in San Francisco, did a similar thing. They have the for-profit, which is the news service, but they also created a nonprofit fund to cover some of the kinds of journalism that just aren't profitable. The caution with hybrids that I'd say is that if you're very small, if you're running a nonprofit and a for-profit, you're running two separate business models and two separate businesses with a limited staff. So people often think, oh, that's a really good way to go, but it also places some burdens on you as well.
There's a question I see from Michelle Haddon. With paid subscriptions and an obvious decline, how do you incentivize readers to become members? Michelle, there's a wonderful thing called the audience funnel. And it is not it's not a sprint. It's a longer term relationship. And so basically the audience funnel says you have folks who are, casual readers, and you move them to occasional readers, and you move them to regular readers. Then you move them to being evangelists for your content and donating to you to support the coverage that you're giving, and then tell other people and share your content and ask other people to support you. So that is not a 2-month process in any way. It's a longer term process, but it's a process you have to be thinking about when you're at the top of the funnel, right? And so let's say you start out with, I don't have the ratio correct in this analogy, but let's say for every 100 people you have at the top of the funnel, 1 or 2 maybe folks that are so engaged that they'll fund you. It truly becomes a numbers game to get as many people in the top of the funnel as possible. But you've got to deliver the content that they're passionate about and are willing to support. And so that speaks to understanding, again, who they are before you ever get going, so that you can sort of create something that people can be passionate about and want to support.
Hey, Michelle, there's a thing you can follow on Medium, and they have blogs maybe posted elsewhere as well, called the Membership Puzzle Project. It's run out of NYU, and Jay Rosen and Emily Goligoski there. And they're doing just tremendous work looking at your very same question all over the world, and how people think about membership and how they think about affiliating with news organizations and so forth. So there's a lot going on, and they write regularly, and it can be fascinating. But everyone's kind of figuring that out as well.
Yeah,
there have been a few small studies that indicated people are more willing to donate than subscribe. Subscribing is more of a transactional thing, whereas they will donate to back what they support. There was one other question I saw here.
There's a question about quality and
Yeah.
how I think that's...
There's a couple of things. What I would say is I don't feel like in most of these publications, everybody's becoming a journalist. To repeat the question, it was, if everyone becomes a journalist, how do you deal with keeping quality up? And isn't it a very skilled profession? I would say absolutely. I think it takes incredible skill, and by and large, the nonprofit news organizations are all professional journalists. The community engagement comes in some interesting ways, though. I mean, you have crowdsourcing, you have tip lines. The engagement with the community may mean taking more story ideas. And then there are some really intriguing models in places like City Bureau in Chicago has this program called the Documenters, right? So journalists aren't at all civic meetings anymore, city council meetings, all the elements of government. And so they do enlist the public, and they train them to document these meetings. They don't do necessarily the same thing as a professional journalist in that they are documenting, they aren't necessarily doing the synthesis. They then come back and there's a core newsroom that helps take the documentation and the witnessing that the general public is doing and applying some journalism and synthesis and ranking and all the things that a skilled journalist does to that. And some of those models are really, really intriguing, but they're early. But for the most part, the work being done in the nonprofits is being done by professional journalists.
I don't see any questions in the chat
Yeah.
or
I
in
don't
Q&A.
either.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap up. You guys can reach us at info@inn.org if another question pops into your mind. Thank you so much for caring about this and for being here. And we have sessions for startups every 2 weeks. If anyone wants to tap into those, these are the kind of discussions we have there and try to help people figure out what they're doing in their communities. So thank you. Bye.